She never got to say the words. One breath before she could tell him, "I'm carrying your child," Cadden Blackwood looked her in the eye and said, "You're not my mate. You never were." Then he walked away to claim another woman in front of the entire pack. 4 years later, Myra Voss arrived at the Lycan King's court with a little girl on her hip and a secret that could burn 3 packs to the ground. Chapter 1. The King Comes to Ashford. The wind chime above the back hall rang once, and Marta didn't look up from the griddle. That was how Sera knew. She'd learned the system without being taught it, the way you learn everything in a border town, through observation and the quiet understanding that some knowledge is safer when it arrives without explanation. The chime meant someone had triggered the motion sensor on the east approach. The east approach meant vehicles coming from Blackmore territory, and Marta not looking up meant she already knew who it was and had decided that her eggs didn't need to burn for it. Sera was at the window before she'd made the conscious decision to move. 3 black SUVs. No plates, or rather, plates that would come back clean on any registry that mattered to humans. The kind of vehicles that belonged to people accustomed to arriving without announcement and leaving without documentation. The lead door opened and a man stepped out who was not quite like other men, the way a river is not quite like other water. Same elements, different gravity. Caius Blackmore. She hadn't seen him in 3 years, 2 months, and some number of days she refused to count because counting implied she was keeping track, and she wasn't. She absolutely wasn't. But her body apparently was, because her hands stopped working properly around the coffee pot she was holding, and she had to set it down before she did something embarrassing with it. He was taller than she remembered, or maybe distance did that compressed memory until the real thing arrived and reasserted its dimensions. Dark coat, dark hair, the particular stillness of someone who'd learned very young that predators don't fidget. He said something to the man beside him, Beta Damon. She recognized the profile, and Damon nodded without looking at whatever Caius was pointing toward. Like he was already aware. Like he was always already aware. 12 feet to the back door. Lyra was in the storage room with a coloring book and a juice box, and outside it was raining at a slant that would soak them both through before they reached the alley, and the alley led to the parking lot, which led to the main road, which led to exactly nowhere fast with a 4-year-old on foot. Sera picked the coffee pot back up. "Marta," she said, her voice doing something impressively normal. "Table 4 needs a refresh." "Table 4 can wait." Marta turned from the griddle finally, and her eyes dark, unhurried, the eyes of a woman who'd seen enough strange things that she'd stopped rating them, moved from Sera's face to the window and back again. Something passed between them that wasn't quite conversation. "You stay on the floor. I'll check on the little one." "She's fine." "I know she's fine. I'm checking anyway." Marta untied her apron with the efficiency of someone who'd already decided, hung it on the hook, and disappeared through the back. The chime rocked gently in her wake, though no door had opened. The bell above the front entrance rang instead. Cold air, the smell of rain and pine and something older underneath it, something that Sera's wolf registered before her mind did, a dark familiar pull that she'd spent 3 years learning to muffle. She kept her back to the door for a count of 4. Then she turned, order pad in hand, with the expression of a woman who had done this particular job long enough that new customers held approximately 0 novelty. 3 men, Caius in the center, Damon to his left, a third enforcer she didn't recognize on the right. They took the corner booth without being led to it, the instinct of people who always choose the seat with sightlines to every exit. She walked over. Her name tag said Sera. She'd chosen the spelling deliberately, the 1-letter distance feeling like something more than it was but necessary anyway. "Morning." She set menus down without making direct eye contact, another habit 3 years in the making. "Coffee while you decide." "Please." The voice was the same, lower than she'd reconstructed it in her head, which had apparently been optimistic in its forgetting. She felt it somewhere behind her sternum, that resonance, and her wolf made a sound like a door being pushed open in a windstorm before she shut it firmly back. She poured coffee, 3 cups, did not spill any of them, counted that as a victory and retreated to the kitchen, where she stood with her back against the steel refrigerator and conducted a rapid, merciless inventory of her options. None of them were good. All of them were hers to navigate alone, the way everything had been for 3 years. From the storage room, she heard Lyra laughing at something Marta was saying, bright and guileless and completely unaware that the specific shape of her eyes, that particular silver gray that no one in Ashford had ever been able to account for, had just walked through the front door and sat down in Sera's station. She pushed off the refrigerator. You stay, you take his order, you get through the shift. That was the whole plan. Simple, survivable. She'd had worse ones. The mornings stretched with the particular cruelty of mornings that refused to move quickly. Caius and his men ate without theater, eggs, black coffee, toast for Damon, who was the only one of them who seemed to eat like a person rather than someone fueling a machine. Their conversation was low and intermittent, and Sera caught fragments without trying. Council session at 11, Elder Roth is already there, the Southern markers need, and then nothing, because one of them would notice her nearby and the sentence would close like a hand around water. She had 4 other tables. She focused on them with missionary dedication. At 9:15, Pell came in. She knew him by his walk, the specific, compressed way he moved through doorways, like he was always preparing for a threshold to punish him. He was 19, looked younger, with the kind of forgettable face that was clearly deliberate maintenance. He'd been in Ashford 6 weeks, and in that time had worked 3 different jobs and slept on a cot in a room above the hardware store that he paid for in cash like everyone in this town who had something to lose. He took a stool at the counter, which was Sera's domain, and she brought him coffee without being asked. Cold out, he said. Raining sideways, she agreed. His gaze moved, not conspicuously, just a flicker, toward the corner booth. She watched his throat work. The mug he was holding shifted in his grip. Don't, she said quietly, refilling his cup though it didn't need it. I'm not doing anything. The not doing is loud. She set the pot down and leaned on the counter at an angle that blocked his sightline to the booth without making it obvious she was doing so. Eat something. You look like the rain got all the way inside you. He ordered oatmeal and didn't speak again for 10 minutes, which was its own kind of conversation. Sera had learned that Pell communicated most honestly in the spaces between words. The pause before he agreed to something meant he was afraid. The pause before he refused meant he'd already decided and was just finding the courage to say it. Right now, his pauses were short and frequent, and his eyes kept wanting to go places she didn't want them to go. She was managing this. The booth, Pell, the rain, the clock on the wall that moved like it was doing her a personal disservice, when the storage room door opened and Lyra appeared. Sera saw it happening with the terrible slow-motion clarity of things you cannot stop and cannot look away from. Lyra had finished the coloring book. She had also, apparently, finished the juice box and finished whatever other acceptable forms of containment Marta had provided, because she was standing in the doorway in her little green cardigan with her dark curls escaping their braids, and her expression was the one that meant she had decided the world, outside the storage room, was more interesting than the one inside it. She was 4. She went where interesting was. Lyra, Sera started. Too late. Lyra had already spotted the dining room and its occupants with the comprehensive, unbiased attention of a child who hadn't yet learned to pretend that people weren't worth looking at. She walked out, not running, not cautious, just walking, the way she always moved, like the floor had made specific promises to her feet. She stopped in front of the corner booth. The enforcer on the right noticed her first and went very still in the way large men go still around small children they're not sure what to do with. Damon's gaze dropped to her with an expression that was carefully, professionally neutral. Caius looked up last. Lyra studied him. He studied her back. The air in that small radius went strange. He smells like my dreams, Lyra said, to no one in particular. Pure observation, no performance in it. The way she might note that the rain was loud or the oatmeal was lumpy. Pell's coffee mug touched the counter with a sound like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Caius went absolutely still. It wasn't the stillness of shock or confusion. It was something more fundamental than that, older, the kind of cessation that belongs to an animal that has caught a scent it wasn't expecting and has stopped everything else to understand it. His eyes, which were dark brown in ordinary light, shifted. Not dramatically. Just enough, a ring of amber at the edges that came and went in the space of a breath. His wolf, present, alert. Sera was across the diner in 6 steps, her hand on Lyra's shoulder, her voice already doing the gentle, redirecting thing that sounded like everything was fine and communicated quite clearly that it was not. "Sweetheart, you're supposed to be with Marta." "I finished the book." "I know you did, bub. Come on." Lyra went, but she looked back once over her shoulder at the corner booth, with that clear, uncomplicated certainty of hers that always made Sera's chest do something complicated. Like she was noting the location of something she intended to return to. Damon's gaze followed them to the kitchen door. He was cataloging something. Sera could feel it the way you feel a camera, the awareness of being measured. She didn't look at him. She kept her hand on Lyra's shoulder and kept moving and did not let herself think about the way Caius had gone still, about what his wolf had found in that moment, about the math that was sitting in the room behind her like a lit fuse. She settled Lyra at the kitchen table with a fresh box of crayons and Marta's particular brand of gentle authority. Then she stood at the pass-through, the narrow window between kitchen and dining room, and looked at the corner booth. Caius was watching the kitchen door. Not the room, not his coffee, the door. She took her break at 10 and sat on the back step with a cup of tea she didn't drink, watching the rain thin to a drizzle against the alley pavement. 6 weeks ago, she'd been fine. Fine was a modest word, but it was accurate. She had Lyra. She had the apartment. She had Marta and the job and the particular satisfaction of a life built entirely by her own hands from materials no one had given her. It wasn't the life she'd imagined at 22, when she'd been young enough to believe that the bond her wolf had recognized was real, that she had a future in a pack, that the specific warmth of being claimed by something larger than yourself was something she'd get to keep. She hadn't been stupid, exactly, just inexperienced in the specific way that trusting people makes you inexperienced. Caius had said, "You're not my mate," and she'd thought the way the young and devastated always think that maybe the bond had made a mistake, maybe she'd misread it. Wolves did that sometimes, she told herself, recognized the wrong person, felt the wrong pull. It happened. It was documented. She'd told herself that for about 3 months, right up until a test confirmed what her body had understood before her mind was ready to. The back door opened, and Marta sat down beside her, not quite touching, but present in that particular solid way of hers. "They're still there," Sera said. "I know." "How long is this territory thing supposed to take?" Marta wrapped both hands around her own mug. "Roth said a week, maybe 2. She paused. "If it goes to extended session longer." Sera absorbed this, set her untouched tea down on the step. "He didn't recognize me." She said it neutrally, testing how it felt. It felt like something, unfortunately. "He will." Marta said it without cruelty, which was the only way Marta said difficult things. "You can't stop that, so what you need to decide is what comes after." "I've been deciding that for 3 years." "You've been postponing it for 3 years." The older woman glanced at her sideways. "There's a difference, and you know it." Sera didn't answer. In the kitchen behind them, she could hear Lyra narrating something to herself in the focused, elaborate way she did when she was deep in an imaginary scenario, her voice rising and falling with the cadence of someone who took their stories very seriously. She was her father's daughter in that way, the seriousness. The way authority sat naturally on her even at 4 years old, easy as breathing. Sera had always tried not to think about that too much. Today she couldn't stop. "He looked at her," she said finally. Marta nodded. "His wolf," she stopped, started again. Something registered, he didn't know what it was yet. "No," Marta agreed, "but he'll figure out the question before he figures out the answer. That's how they always work." She stood, straightening with the mild effort of a body that had earned its years. "The chime goes off, I'll let you know, but I don't think he's leaving before the council session." She went back inside. The door settled shut. Sera sat in the drizzle for another 2 minutes. Then, because she was her mother's daughter as much as anything else, stubborn, practical, allergic to surrender, she picked up her tea, drank the cold of it without making a face, and went back to work. She was refilling the carafe when she felt it. Not heard, not saw, felt, in the specific register of her half-muffled wolf, a pressure change in the room. She turned. Caius was looking at her, not at the kitchen, not at the door. At her directly, with an expression that was doing something more complex than she could quickly categorize. He wrapped his hand around his coffee cup, then he set it back down, slowly. "You look familiar," he said. Not an accusation, not even a question, technically, more like a man nodding something aloud to see what it did when it hit the air. Sera met his eyes for the first time all morning, which was a mistake, but the only mistake available. "I get that a lot," she said. "Common face." He considered this. The amber was gone from his irises, fully dark now, controlled. A king's face, composed and giving nothing away. But his wolf, she knew. Because she knew his wolf the way you know the landscape of a place you've been exiled from, by memory and ache and the specific grief of detail. His wolf was not composed at all. Chapter 2, Silver Eyes Don't Forget. He ordered a second coffee he didn't need, and that told Sera everything about his intentions for the morning. She brought it without comment, kept her pen on her pad, kept her eyes on the notepad, kept everything where it belonged. The name tag. The pen. The careful, practiced distance of a woman who has learned that ordinary is the best armor available and wears it like chain mail. Damon watched her pour. That was the thing about Damon. He had one of those faces that managed to look politely uninterested while absorbing everything. She remembered him from 3 years ago, a peripheral figure in the Blackmore estate. Steady, precise, loyal in the way that went deeper than duty. He had recognized her. She was certain of it. He'd done nothing with that recognition yet, which was either reassuring or the most unsettling thing in the room. The council meeting was scheduled for 11. It was 9:42. She moved through her other tables with the muscle memory of 18 months at this job, and the morning ground forward. Rain picked up again. 2 truckers came in and took the long booth. A woman with a toddler sat at the window and ordered pancakes. Normal things. The architecture of normal that Sera had built piece by careful piece and lived inside like a house she'd constructed from scratch, knowing all its specific drafts. At 10:10, Marta reappeared at the kitchen door with a meaningful look. Lyra had finished the second coloring book too. Sera crossed the room but didn't make it in time, which she'd known she wouldn't, because Lyra moved at the speed of curiosity, and curiosity in a 4-year-old is not negotiable. The second emergence was less gradual than the first. Lyra came out already in motion, already decided, already somewhere in the middle of a thought that happened to require her to be in the dining room. She had a crayon behind her ear, purple, and her cardigan was now on backwards because she'd taken it off and put it back on herself, which she insisted on doing. Sera tracked her path with the helpless attention of a parent watching their child do something unstoppable. Lyra did not go back to the corner booth directly. She went to the window first and pressed her nose to the glass to look at the rain, which she did sometimes at home. Then she turned, apparently satisfied, and walked toward the counter, and stopped midway there, aligned precisely with the corner booth, as if some internal compass had interrupted her original route. Her head turned. She looked at Caius. He was already looking at her. He'd been watching her since she came through the kitchen door, Sera realized, not in the overt way that would have been uncomfortable, but in the way that wolves watch things that their instincts have flagged. Peripherally, with the bulk of attention directed elsewhere while the actual focus stays fixed. Lyra put both hands in her cardigan pockets, considered him. "You were in my dream," she informed him, declarative, not wondering. Caius set down his coffee cup. The motion was controlled, but it was also, Sera noted with the precision of someone who'd spent 3 years developing a second-by-second awareness of her own reactions, about a half-second slower than his usual pace. Like something had interrupted the signal between intention and action. Was I, he said, not quite a question. You were a wolf. Lyra tilted her head. A big one, silver. You were running, but I don't think you were scared. I think you were. She paused, searching, with the concentrated effort of someone mining for exactly the right word, looking. The room was not silent. There were other tables, the coffee machine, rain on the windows, but the specific geography of sound had shifted, and Sera felt Damon's stillness from 6 feet away as something physical. Caius said carefully, "What were you doing in the dream?" "Running too," Lyra shrugged, settled the question. "We were the same speed." She said it without particular pride, as fact, and then she spotted the sugar dispenser on the nearest table and went to investigate it instead, attention migrating with the natural fluidity of the very young. Sera materialized beside her. "Lyra, kitchen, now please." Lyra went, this time holding the purple crayon she'd reclaimed from behind her ear, already narrating something quietly to herself. Sera did not look at Caius on her way past. She looked at Damon instead, for one flat second, and what she saw on his face was not the neutral cataloging of before. It was something specific and complicated, a man adding something up and not being surprised by the total, but being troubled by it. He knew. He'd known from the first moment, and now he was sitting with the particular weight of someone deciding what to do with what he knows. By 11, the booth was empty, and the 3 of them were gone. Sera cleared the table. $4 under Caius's coffee cup, not enough to be generous, enough to be sufficient. Damon had left 12, which was either guilt or habit. She didn't care to determine which. She pocketed both and wiped down the table and told herself the hollow feeling in the center of her chest was just the coffee she hadn't eaten breakfast with. Marta watched her from behind the counter, with the expression she reserved for things she'd decided not to say yet. "The Elder Council meets at the old civic building," Sera said, stacking the cups. "How long do those sessions usually run?" "When it's territory, half a day minimum." Marta slid a plate toward her, toast, scrambled eggs, the specific composition of a meal prepared for someone who'd forgotten to eat. "When there's a Lycan King present, longer. The human elders get formal, take extra time choosing their words." Sera ate standing at the counter, because sitting felt like an acknowledgement that she needed to recover, and she wasn't doing that. "Tell me about Voss," she said. Marta's hands slowed on the mug she was washing. Slight pause. "What made you think of him?" "He was watching from the parking lot this morning, before they went inside." She'd caught the movement through the diner window at 9:50, a figure under the hardware store awning across the street, doing nothing obvious, looking at nothing in particular, which was precisely how you looked when you were looking at something specific. "Voss is an elder," Marta said carefully. "He's been on the Ashford Council 12 years. She seemed to consider, cautious about outside interference." "Which side of cautious?" "The kind that wants information before he commits to a position." Marta set the mug down. "I don't know more than that." That was probably true. Marta had a face that was bad at lying and good at partial truths, and this looked like the second thing. Pell came through the door at 12:30, with the demeanor of someone who'd made a decision they weren't at peace with. He sat at the counter, waited until the only other occupied table, the trucker booth, was engaged in loud argument about a football team. Then he pushed a folded piece of paper across the counter to Sera. She opened it without picking it up. A name, an address in a city 6 hours north. Below it, in Pell's small, careful handwriting, "They can do documentation. I need a PAC ID. Without it, I can't work anywhere regulated, and I'm running out of places like this." Sera folded it back up. "Where did you hear about that address?" she said quietly. "One of the Omega networks." He was looking at his coffee. "I know it sounds like a risk. I know you're going to tell me false PAC documentation is a death sentence if it's discovered." "It is. I don't have another option." She looked at him, the compressed way he held himself, the mark she couldn't see through his sleeve but knew was there. The 19 years of someone who'd learned that asking for things got you hurt and was asking anyway because he'd run out of alternatives. "Give me a week," she said. His eyes came up. "To do what?" To think of another option. She slid the paper back to him. Don't contact that address, not yet. He took the paper. He looked like he wanted to argue and had decided the cost was too high. A week, he agreed. She refilled his coffee and moved down the counter and let herself process exactly none of what was accumulating in her chest. Because processing required stopping, and stopping required acknowledging that this morning had happened, and she wasn't doing that yet. At 1:15, the bell above the door rang. She had her back turned. She didn't need to turn to know. Her wolf told her before her eyes could. He sat at the counter this time. Not the booth, the counter, 3 seats from where Pell had been, which was not the choice of a man who wanted distance or the choice of someone conducting routine business. Damon and the enforcer were not with him. He'd come alone, which was either bold or reckless and probably both, and he sat with his hands flat on the counter in the way that said I'm not concealing anything, and looked at her with an expression that had dropped most of its professional composure somewhere between the civic building and here. Sera brought him coffee without speaking. He said, the council session ended early. Most things end at some point, she said. Something in his expression shifted, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it, the thing that almost amusement becomes when the person feeling it is also occupied with something more serious. I'd like to ask you something. You can order instead, she said. It's that kind of establishment. Serafina. She put the coffee pot down. She did it carefully, with both hands, because the alternative was doing it with one hand while the other one did something she couldn't predict. Her name in his voice was a whole different texture than she'd been ready for, even knowing it was coming, even knowing it had been only a matter of time. She turned to face him. He was looking at her the way someone looks at a thing they've been circling for hours and have finally decided to approach directly, not aggressive, but resolved, the way you look when you've run out of the energy it takes to be indirect. How did you know? She said. I should have known in the first 5 minutes. Something moved across his face, not guilt exactly, more like the look of someone doing a fast, honest accounting of where they failed. My wolf knew before I did. Took me until the girl. He stopped. Her name is Lyra. Lyra, he tried the word in his mouth. Something about his face when he said it made her need to look at the space behind his shoulder rather than directly at him, so she did that. How old is she? Not a question. The way you look familiar hadn't been a question. The way he was sitting with the answer already present and just needed it said aloud to make it real. 4, Sera said. The counter between them was 2 feet of linoleum and an uncrossable distance. And also, possibly, the only thing keeping the conversation from becoming something neither of them was equipped to have in a public diner on a Wednesday afternoon. I'd like to speak with you properly, he said. Not here. This is where I work. I know, I'm asking for outside of work. She looked at him then, directly, which she'd been managing not to do all day, and she let herself see what was on his face instead of what she'd been bracing to see. She'd expected authority, control, the specific cold efficiency of a man who had looked at a bond and found it beneath his political requirements. What she saw instead was a man who'd walked into a small diner in a border town and found something he hadn't known he'd lost, and was operating on the inadequate instruments of someone who'd just discovered the extent of his navigation error. It wasn't enough. 3 years of not enough had been building in her chest since 9 that morning, and what was on his face right now didn't balance any of it. But she said, my shift ends at 3. He nodded. He picked up his coffee. He drank it like a man who was using the act of drinking as something to do with his hands, while his mind worked through something complicated. At the end of the counter, behind the kitchen pass-through, Marta had her eyes on Sera in the reflection of the toaster. She wasn't saying anything. She was just present in that solid, particular way of hers, the way that said, I'm here, I know, I'm not leaving you alone with this. It was, improbably, the most stabilizing thing in the room. Sera went back to work. 3 o'clock was 45 minutes away. She filled it one table at a time. Chapter 3, the name she buried. 3 o'clock came, and he was gone. Not the booth, she checked. not the parking lot, not the sidewalk visible through the front window. She stood with her apron folded over her arm, and the rain still coming down, and felt something land that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite disappointment, but occupied the same uncomfortable space where those two things share a border. "He went to make calls," Marta said from behind her. "Saw him on the phone as he left." "Right," Sera shouldered her bag. "I'm taking Lyra to the park if it stops raining enough." "It will." Marta said this with the confidence she applied to weather, recipes, and human behavior equally. "Take the long way." The long way meant avoiding the civic building, which was where Damon and the enforcer had presumably returned. Sera took the long way, Lyra on her hip for the first block, until Lyra protested loudly that she was for Mama, not a baby, and clambered down to walk with the determined independence that characterized every aspect of her existence. The rain did stop. Pale afternoon light came through the cloud break, thin but genuine, and the park at the edge of Ashford, 3 benches, a climbing structure, a stand of white birch that Lyra considered personally hers, emerged from the gray with the specific relief of a place you needed. Lyra went immediately to the climbing structure. Sera sat on the bench and let herself breathe for the first time all day. Real breathing, chest fully extended, the kind that actually reaches the bottom of the lungs. She'd spent the entire shift doing the compressed, managed version, and the accumulated debt of it sat between her shoulders like a stone. She'd gotten away with it. The morning, the name, the counter, the 45 minutes of after 3. He'd been pulled away before it could become something she had to navigate without preparation. This was good, reasonable. She needed preparation. She needed, at minimum, to decide what she was going to say and in what order, and what she was absolutely not going to say under any circumstances, which was a list that at this point had more entries than the other one. "He's behind you," Lyra said from the top of the climbing structure. Sera's hands went still on her knees. She turned slowly. Caius Blackmore was 20 feet away, standing at the park's entrance, phone in hand, mid-pace. He'd seen her at the same moment Lyra had announced him. She could tell by the way he stopped, a 1-second interruption in the call's rhythm before he said something brief into the phone and ended it. For a moment, neither of them moved. He was not, she noticed with useless specificity, wearing the dark coat from this morning. He had one arm of his jacket pushed up where he'd held the phone, and without the formal weight of the coat, he looked less like the Lycan King and more like a man who'd had a long day that showed. He put the phone in his pocket, crossed the wet grass toward her bench with the even, unhurried stride of someone who decided not to approach this like an ambush, even though the geography hadn't cooperated. "I wasn't following you," he said. "Your circuits happen to run through the one park in Ashford." He sat on the far end of the bench. Not near, there was distance between them, a deliberate space that said I'm aware of the boundary. "My circuit runs from the civic building to the East Road and back. This park is exactly in the center of it." Convenient. Genuinely accidental. He looked out at the climbing structure, where Lyra was now hanging upside down from the middle bar with her dark curls pointing at the ground and the purple crayon tucked into her pocket. Something in his expression did something quiet and unmanaged that he didn't appear aware of. "She isn't afraid of anything," he said. "She's afraid of moths," Sera said. "Specifically, nothing else so far." The corner of his mouth moved. "Why moths?" "I genuinely don't know. She saw one in the kitchen in June and went rigid. I've never seen her do that with anything else, including actual wolves on nature documentaries." She stopped. She'd said wolves without thinking, and the word sat between them now doing its specific work. He turned to look at her. Not the king's face, the other one, the one from the counter at 1:15, the one doing honest accounting. "I need to tell you something." "You already said that." "I know, you're not making it easy." "I'm not trying to make it hard either," she said. "I'm sitting on a bench in a park while my daughter does acrobatics. You can say whatever you came to say." He said, "I was wrong." She'd expected a lot of things. That specific combination of 3 words, delivered without architecture or preamble, hadn't been in the repertoire of possibilities she'd built. Her hands, resting on her thighs, did nothing visible. Internally, something moved that she had no interest in examining in this location. 3 years ago, he continued, not defensive, careful, in the way of someone who's decided to tell the truth and is concentrating on doing it without embellishment. What I said to you was wrong. How I handled it was wrong. That's a substantial concession, she said, and her voice came out steadier than it had any right to. What changed? Seeing you, pause, seeing her. That's convenient timing. He looked at her steadily. I know how it sounds. Does it matter, knowing how it sounds? Yes, because I'm not saying it for strategy. I'm saying it because it's true and not saying it would be. He stopped, and she watched him find a word and discard it, find another. Cowardly, he settled on, and I've already done enough of that. The park was quiet except for Lyra's narration from the climbing structure. She'd invented a story involving the birch trees and some kind of political situation between them that required frequent dramatic announcements. And somewhere behind the cloud, Cover the Sun was trying to make a second appearance and mostly failing. The shard arrived the way it always did when she was tired, and her defenses had been depleted by a day of managing the unmanageable. Not a flood, just a shard, clean and specific. His study, the Blackmore estate, the smell of old wood and authority, his voice flat and final. You're not my mate. Whatever your wolf is telling you, ignore it. You're dismissed from this pack. Not cruel, exactly. Efficient. The careful, bloodless precision of a man making a difficult administrative decision. She'd walked out with her shoulders back and her chin level and hadn't cried until she was in her car on the highway with the estate in the rearview mirror. And then she had cried for 22 straight minutes before pulling over because she couldn't see the road. There was a political arrangement, she said, not a question. She'd figured that part out eventually in the months that followed when she'd started putting things together. He didn't look surprised that she knew. Yes, the Vale line, a proposed match that the council had been working on for 2 years before the bond registered. He said bond registered with an odd precision, like the clinical framing was the only one he could say without it costing him too much. I chose the political arrangement. I told myself the bond was too new to be certain. Was it? He took a long time with this. A full 10 seconds, which was unusual for someone who operated in rooms where every hesitation is catalogued. No, he said. I was certain. I chose anyway. The honesty of it was almost worse than if he'd made excuses. She'd been ready for excuses. Excuses she knew how to receive and where to put them. Why are you telling me this now? She said. Because you deserve to know. Then, and because I have a daughter I've never met who runs in my wolf's dreams and I'd like to, he stopped again. Something in his jaw worked. I don't know what I'd like. That's the most honest thing I can give you right now. From the climbing structure, Lyra had descended and was now crouching at the base of one of the birch trees, examining something on the bark with the intense, focused attention she brought to anything she'd decided was important. Sera watched her. You should know, she said, that knowing this changes nothing about how I've conducted the last 3 years. I'm not going to regret building a life because you've had a realignment. I'm not asking you to. I don't know what you're asking. Neither do I, he said again, and it was the second time he'd admitted uncertainty, and twice in 10 minutes from a Lycan King she was not going to notice that. She wasn't. Elder Voss was by the park gate when she gathered Lyra to leave. She'd seen him before she'd named him, the same figure from the parking lot this morning, the under-the-awning stillness, but this time there was no awning and no pretense of not watching. He was an older man, slight, with the drywood quality of someone who'd spent decades indoors in rooms where decisions were made. He nodded at her. Precise, formal, not friendly. Chaos had stood when she stood, the automatic courtesy of old conditioning. He saw Voss and something in his posture shifted, a small recalibration, the Lycan King reassembling over the man who'd been sitting on a park bench. Elder Voss, he said, neutral, the way you name a thing you aren't sure of yet. Voss looked at Chaos briefly. Then his gaze went to Sera, not Lyra, specifically not Lyra, which was itself a kind of looking, and he said, "Miss Calloway, I'd recommend, in the interest of your own peace, limiting public exposure this week." Sera pulled Lyra's hand gently into hers. That's an unusual thing for an elder to say to a private citizen. "We live in an unusual week," Voss said. He nodded again, at Caius, at her, at no one, and turned and walked away toward the civic building. Caius watched him go. His eyes had gone darker. "What was that?" Sera said. "I don't know yet." He said it with a flatness that meant he had a suspicion he wasn't sharing. Then he looked at her, and then at Lyra, who had been silent for about 45 seconds, which was her maximum silence threshold. "Are you going to be here tomorrow?" Lyra asked him, tilting her head. Caius crouched down to her level, the way he'd done in Sera's diner, the same without the audience of Damon and the enforcer, and somehow more real for it. "I am," he said. "Okay," Lyra nodded gravely. "I thought so." She patted his knee with the purple crayon she'd been holding this whole time, apparently conferring something, and then turned and tugged Sera's hand in the direction of home. Sera let herself be tugged. She didn't look back. In her apartment that night, after Lyra was asleep, deeply, untroubled, the sleep of someone who didn't yet carry anything heavy, Sera sat on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinets, and her knees pulled to her chest, and stayed there for a long time. Not crying, just sitting, letting the day have its full weight now that there was no one watching. The wolf in her chest, muffled and scarred for 3 years, turned over once, slow, tentative, like a thing checking whether the ground had changed. She pressed her fist lightly against her sternum. Not yet, she thought. I don't know enough yet. Her wolf subsided, but it didn't go back to sleep. From the bedroom, Lyra's voice came soft and sleepy from some dream. Not words, just sound. Comfortable sound. The sound of someone in the middle of a story she trusted was going somewhere good. Sera listened to it until the kitchen stopped feeling like a confessional. Then she got up, drank a glass of water, and went to bed. In the morning, she decided, she would figure out what Elder Voss had meant. She'd figure out the shape of this thing and where she stood in it. She'd make a list, practical and numbered, and she'd work through it the way she worked through every impossible thing she'd ever faced. Right now she needed 6 hours, at minimum. She closed her eyes. Lyra from the dark. Mama, is the silver-eyed man going to stay? Sera kept her eyes closed. Her hand found the edge of the blanket. I don't know yet, bub, she said quietly. A pause, then. I think he is. She had no answer for that. Lyra didn't need one. She'd already gone back under, her breathing deep and even. Sera lay in the dark and thought about the way Caius had crouched to Lyra's eye level, and the purple crayon being patted against his knee, and I don't know what I'd like. That's the most honest thing I can give you right now. And the wolf in her chest turned over again, quiet and persistent, like something that had been waiting a long time and had learned, in the waiting, how to be patient. Chapter 4. What Damon Knows. Marta had a policy about quitting. She didn't permit it on Tuesdays. It's the worst day to make permanent decisions, she explained, setting a stack of clean menus on the counter. Everything feels worse on Tuesdays. Everyone knows this. It's Thursday, Sera said. Then it's also not a good day. Marta straightened the menus with architectural precision. Friday is possible. Friday at least has logic. Sera tied her apron. I'm not quitting, I was just considering it. Marta looked at her without judgment and with the particular bluntness that was her form of affection. I know the look. You've had it since 7:30. She turned back to her griddle. You don't have anywhere better to be. You know that, I know that. Let's not perform the consideration. The diner was quiet at 8, the early regulars, the crossword man in the first booth, the 2 women from the plant nursery who came in every Thursday and always ordered the same thing and never seemed to discuss anything except hostas. Normal. Safe. Caius did not come for breakfast. She noticed this in the way you notice the absence of a sound you'd been bracing for, the odd, negative relief of it, the way the morning opened up without the specific management required by his presence. She moved through her tables without the compression she'd carried yesterday, and by 9:30, she'd almost convinced herself the previous day had been the whole of it, an anomaly, a weather event that had passed. At 9:47, Damon came in alone. He sat at the counter. He ordered coffee and toast without looking at the menu, and he waited until she came to refill his cup to look at her with an expression that had shed all its professional neutrality and arrived at something considerably more direct. "We need to talk," he said, low. The two women from the plant nursery were deep in a conversation about rootstock 3 seats away. "Not here, but here is what's available." Sera set the pot down. "You knew who I was the moment you walked in yesterday." "Yes." "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because I needed to assess the situation before determining which way the information should move." He lifted his coffee cup, and she understood he was using the gesture to avoid someone reading his lip movements from across the room. "Sera, can I call you that?" "You're about to regardless. Caius is dealing with a challenge." He said it quietly, with the flatness of someone reporting weather. "A formal blood rights challenge filed by Marcus Vale, Alpha of the Northern Vale Pack. It goes before the Lycan High Council in." He checked his watch, not because he needed to, she thought, but because it bought a second. 23 days. She folded her hands on the counter. "What kind of challenge?" "The kind that argues Caius has no true heir and no bonded Luna. Under old Lycan succession law, an alpha king without blood continuity is considered a transitional ruler, vulnerable to replacement." He paused. "Vale has been building this case for 18 months. It's solid." She was very still. "And you're telling me this because?" "Because you walked into this situation 3 years ago without knowing the full picture, and I'm not going to let that happen twice." He met her eyes directly. Something in his face was doing something more complicated than strategy, something that looked like the specific exhaustion of a man who'd been carrying too much alone and was choosing, carefully, to put down part of the weight. A verified blood heir would end the challenge. Immediately. Irrefutably. The crossword man turned a page of his newspaper with a sound like a small decision. "Lyra," Sera said. "Yes." She breathed through her nose, slow. "You've already thought through how to verify it." "Blood registry records. I have a contact on the High Council, an elder named Solis, who would receive and authenticate the documentation without political interference." He watched her face. "I haven't done anything. I'm telling you first. That was a deliberate choice." "Why?" "Because she's your daughter," he said, like it was obvious, like it was the only possible answer. "And because you didn't get choices the last time, and that was a failure of." He stopped. "It was wrong. What happened 3 years ago was wrong. I should have pushed back harder on his decision. I was his beta, I should have pushed." She studied him. In 3 years of constructing the story of what happened, of determining who bore what share of the failure, she hadn't particularly factored in Damon. He'd been peripheral in her accounting. The look on his face right now suggested his accounting had been different. "He doesn't know you're telling me this," she said. "He doesn't know I'm aware of your full situation yet, no." He drank his coffee, set it down. "He will. I'm not hiding this from him indefinitely, but I wanted to have a conversation with you first." From outside, the parking lot side, south approach, she heard the soft chime of the back hall sensor. Then she heard Caius's voice, not raised, just present and carrying the specific low register that her wolf's scarred interior caught before her ears fully processed it. "What exactly are you two discussing?" He was at the counter entrance, jacket open, and his eyes moved from Damon to Sera and back with the precision of someone who'd learned to read rooms the way others read text. Damon, to his significant credit, did not visibly flinch. "Your preference in toast," he said. "Whether or not you'd want breakfast. Turns out Sera here makes recommendations." Sera. He'd used her name tag name deliberately, and Sera filed that away. Caius looked at Sera. She picked up the coffee pot and kept her expression in the middle register of helpful professionalism. "We also have a daily special. The eggs are good today." Something moved in his expression, not quite acceptance of the deflection, more like a man notating that the deflection happened and choosing to let it stand for now. He sat 2 seats from Damon. "Coffee," he said, "and whatever the special is." "Good choice," she poured without spillage. Small ongoing victory. He ate without pushing the conversation further, which was more restraint than she'd have credited him with yesterday. He and Damon talked, actual business, council session notes, a call he needed to make before noon with someone in the Northern Territory, and Sera moved through her tables and let the normalcy of it almost convince her. Almost. At 10:30, Pell came in, took his counter stool and froze. Caius was still at the counter. 3 seats separated them, but the space between a person fleeing pack jurisdiction and an alpha king was not measurable in seats. Pell's hands went into his lap. The compressed way he held himself became something more acute. Sera brought his coffee before he could make a decision that wasn't good for him. She set it down with a small pressure of her hand on his elbow, the lightest possible grounding, there and gone. He didn't move. Caius glanced down the counter. His gaze rested on Pell with the automatic assessment of an alpha cataloging a wolf in his proximity, age, status, stress level. Pell was broadcasting stress level in a frequency that anyone with pack instinct could hear. It wasn't subtle. "You're not from Ashford," Caius said. Pell's jaw moved. "No, sir." "Which pack?" A pause so long it had its own weight. "I'm currently unaffiliated." Caius's eyes tracked down to Pell's forearm. He couldn't see the brand through the sleeve, Sera knew, but he could sense something there. The slight way Pell held that arm. Voluntarily. Pell said nothing, which was also an answer. Caius looked at Sera. She looked back with the neutral expression of a woman who had decided that if the king of the Lycans wanted information from her counter, he would need to ask her directly and give her a reason to provide it. He seemed to register this. He returned his attention to his coffee without pressing. Damon, she noticed, was watching all 3 of them. She went to the kitchen, set down the coffee pot, pressed both hands flat against the cool steel of the counter and counted to 6. "He's in the middle of your life now," some honest part of her said. Not the edges, not the parking lot or a park bench or a counter. The actual middle. He was sitting 10 feet from Pell, who needed protection she couldn't legally give him. He was sitting 10 feet from a conversation Damon had started that could crack open the careful container she'd built around Lyra's existence. The middle. She thought of what Marta had said 3 days ago. Running is a luxury you've already spent. She picked up the coffee pot and went back out. By afternoon, the council session had resumed, and the diner settled into its quiet midweek rhythm, and Sera put Lyra down for a late nap in the apartment above the hardware store, Pell's space, borrowed for the afternoon, because Marta's back room was occupied with a delivery, and sat on the narrow windowsill while Lyra slept. She watched the civic building across the street. Damon came out at 4:15. He walked directly to the hardware store, which meant he'd known where she was, which meant he'd been tracking her the way pack wolves tracked without always being conscious of it. He came up the outside stairs, knocked. She opened the door. He looked different without Caius present, still composed, but the layer underneath the composure was visible in a way it wasn't in company. He looked, she thought, like a man who hadn't slept properly in weeks. "Come in," she said quietly because Lyra. He came in, took stock of the space, the cot, the folding table, the crayon marks on the one bare wall that Lyra had apparently begun adding to in the hour before her nap, a garden scene with trees that were technically accurate in some botanical universe. "She drew those," he said. "In about 40 minutes. Sera sat on the folding chair. "She doesn't do anything slowly." Something soft moved through his expression. He sat on the other chair, there were only 2, and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and looked at his hands for a moment before he looked at her. "What I told you this morning," he said. "About Vale, there's more." "Go on." "I've been running communications with Elder Solis for 3 months, behind Caius's back." He said it without apology but with full acknowledgement. "Caius would have stopped me. He has a very specific relationship with what he considers acceptable forms of action. He doesn't bend rules, even when the rules are killing him. He paused. It's one of his better qualities, and it has been, in this particular situation, a serious problem. You did it anyway. I have a very specific relationship with watching him lose things he doesn't have to lose. He looked up. He lost you. Whatever you think of how that happened, however you've had to rebuild from it, it cost him too. He just doesn't. He stopped again, and she saw him do the thing she'd seen once before, select and discard words, land on the right one. He doesn't say the things he's carrying. He just carries them. She didn't know what to do with that. She filed it in the section of her mind labeled information to be examined later when alone. Vale is going to move on the challenge in 23 days, Damon said. I have the blood test arranged through Solis. I need your consent. Lyra's not mine to document, and this has to be voluntary. What happens if I say no? Caius loses the challenge. Vale takes a seat on the High Council with enough power to limit Blackmore's authority. Maybe not immediately, but over time. He met her eyes. And Lyra's heritage goes unrecognized indefinitely. She grows up with a dormant wolf and no pack claim and no protection. The last part was the one that arrived in her chest, like something sharpened. She looked at the wall, Lyra's trees, the careful amateur garden of a 4-year-old with her father's precision and her mother's imagination. And she felt the familiar weight of a decision that had stopped being theoretical and become simply, unavoidably, real. Give me until tomorrow morning, she said. Damon nodded. He stood. At the door, he stopped without turning around. For what it's worth, he said quietly, I think you built something extraordinary. In 3 years with nothing, you built something extraordinary. He needs to understand that. She said nothing. He left. In the cot, Lyra stirred, turned, resettled, one arm flung out, the way she slept when she was dreaming about running. Sera watched her and thought about protection and recognition and the specific complexity of choices that have no clean options, only options with different costs. She'd made hard choices before. She'd figure out which hard choice this was. Chapter 5, The Thing His Wolf Remembers. She told Damon yes at 7 a.m, 2 words through a text on the prepaid phone he'd left her. And then she took Lyra to the park because the sky had cleared, and Lyra had been inside for too long, and some problems you navigate better with air moving around you. The white birches were doing something luminous in the morning light, the bark catching it, and holding it differently than the wet dark of the last few days. Lyra ran ahead on the path with the loose-limbed freedom of a child who lived entirely in her body, arms out for balance she didn't need, narrating to herself in the ongoing serial drama of her internal world. Sera sat on the bench. She had made her decision. She had sent the 2 words. The rest was architecture, timing, logistics, consequences, which she could manage because she was good at managing things and had been managing this specific category of impossible for 3 years. What she wasn't managing, at 7:15 on a Thursday morning with dew still on the grass, was the sensation of having made a choice that could not be unmade. She'd made those before. She was acquainted with the particular vertigo of their aftermath. She heard him before she saw him, not his footstep, not any deliberate sound, but the change in the air that her wolf caught and catalogued and communicated to her in the muffled language they'd developed for 3 years of partial coexistence. She'd stopped pretending that register didn't work. It worked. She just managed what she did with its information. Caius came through the park entrance from the east side, which was not the civic building direction but the estate road direction, which meant he'd been out earlier than she'd expected and had been walking rather than driving. He was in running clothes. He'd stopped running at the gate, apparently, and was now looking at her and Lyra with an expression that might have been surprise and was probably not. She gestured at the bench, not warmly, but not unwelcomingly either. He sat, left the same deliberate space as yesterday. His breathing was still slightly elevated from the run, and she noticed, not wanting to notice, the way his jaw held a day and a half of growth that he hadn't bothered with, and the way he looked less assembled out here than he ever had inside any official room. I know about the challenge, she said. He went very still. Damon told me, don't be angry with him. He was trying to, she considered, Fill in information that you were withholding for reasons that no longer applied once I was in the picture. A silence. She watched him manage something, not anger at Damon exactly, she thought, or not only that, something more specific. What did he tell you? Enough. She turned to check on Lyra, who was at the climbing structure. I told him yes, to the documentation. His head turned sharply toward her. It's not for you, she said before he could respond. I need you to understand that. Lyra deserves pack recognition regardless of what happens between you and me, or doesn't. I'm not negotiating. I'm clarifying. He was quiet for a moment, then understood. Good. Another pause longer. She could feel him sorting through the information, the yes, the clarification, the lines she'd drawn, and not pushing past any of them, which cost him something she could see on his face but couldn't name. Vale, he said finally. I should have told you about the challenge myself, last night. Probably. I was trying to. He stopped, and she heard him make the same word selection process she'd started to recognize as his honest accounting mode. Protect the situation from getting more complicated before I'd figured out how I felt. How you felt, she said, is not the most important variable right now. No, he agreed. Lyra is. She looked at him when he said her name, full, no hesitation, Lyra, like he'd been saying it for 4 years instead of 4 minutes. Her ribs did something uncomfortable. At the climbing structure, Lyra had reached the top platform and was surveying the park with the proprietary satisfaction of someone who'd claimed territory. The shift happened at the far tree line. She caught it in her peripheral vision first movement that was too fast and too fluid for human, a man shape losing its edges in a way that made the light wrong around it. One of the Blackmore Patrol enforcers, she realized, the one from the first morning, the unknown face. He'd come too close to a boundary marker, or something in the territorial tension of the last few days had accumulated in his system to a breaking point, or both. The partial shift was involuntary. She could tell by the quality of the sounds coming from the tree line, the low, distressed rumble of someone fighting their own body. Bones were doing things bones shouldn't do in daylight 30 feet from a public park. Caius was off the bench before she'd finished processing it. He covered the distance in a way that humans didn't cover distances, not running exactly, moving with a directness that had nothing wasted in it. And he reached the enforcer at the tree line and said 3 words she couldn't fully hear at this distance. Low, flat, with a frequency underneath them that she felt rather than heard. The alpha's voice not as command, but as anchor, as a return point for a wolf that had lost its way back to its own skin. The sound stopped. The enforcer stood at the tree line with his hands against a birch trunk and his back to the park, taking long, deliberate breaths. He was a young man, she saw now younger than she'd registered. 20, maybe, in his patrol jacket, with the specific humiliation of someone who'd lost control publicly and knew it and was being quietly helped to recover without an audience. Caius said something else. Private, close. Not the alpha command, the other thing, the personal steadying. The enforcer straightened, nodded, moved back into the tree line and away. Caius returned to the bench and sat down like nothing had happened. What did you say to him? She said. His name and come back. He looked at his hands. That's usually enough. She absorbed this. In 3 years outside pack life, she'd almost forgotten the texture of it. The way a pack functioned not through fear or hierarchy alone, but through this specific frequency of belonging. The way an alpha's presence was a signal that said this is the shape of our pack, and everyone inside that shape oriented toward it without thinking. She'd grown up in a small pack, her mother's pack, long dissolved. And she'd felt it as a child and missed it as an adult and refused to think about what it meant to have had access to it and lost it. Do you ever shift anymore? He said. She knew what he was doing. Not manipulation, she'd have recognized that. This was something more uncomfortable, actual wanting to know. Not fully, she said. Not for a while. He looked at her. She felt the look as a physical thing, specific and not impersonal. Since when? She watched Lyra, who had noticed nothing, who was descending the climbing structure with great focus and was now examining the birch bark for interesting properties. "Since the rejection," she said, flat, factual. A long silence, the kind that has something moving through it even when nothing is said. "What happens when you try?" he said. "It stops." She put her hands in her jacket pockets. "Part way, like..." She searched for something that would be accurate without being more than she wanted to give. The signal gets interrupted. "The bond scar," he said quietly. "I assumed." "Can I..." He stopped, revised. "I would like to understand what I'm responsible for, fully, not the political version of it." She turned to look at him, and his expression was the most open she'd seen it, which was not particularly open in an objective sense, but was, for him, the equivalent of standing in a doorway without armor, and she registered it against her will. Across the park, Pell appeared at the gate. He saw chaos, started to retreat, and then seemed to make a decision and stayed. He came toward the bench with his characteristic careful gait, his left arm at an angle that protected his forearm without him consciously knowing he was doing it. He stopped a few feet away, looked at Sera. She nodded very slightly. He pushed up his sleeve. The brand on his forearm was about 4 inches long, not decorative, not ceremonial, the aggressive practical marking of someone staking a claim they had no legal right to stake. She watched Caius look at it. She watched the alpha's stillness become something different, a quality of attention that was not neutral at all. "Who put this on you?" Caius said. Pell's voice, when it came, was even, practiced even. "An alpha in the northern region. He's allied with..." He paused, "with Marcus Vale." Caius looked at the mark for another long moment. Then he said, not loudly, "Sit down." Pell sat on the far end of the bench, Sera in the middle, Caius on the other end, and Lyra, as if summoned by the specific gravity of adults having important conversations, materialized from the birch trees and stood in front of Caius without apparent uncertainty. "Can you talk to wolves?" she asked. Caius's attention shifted from Pell to Lyra with a speed that wasn't calculated. It was just where his eyes went. "I can," he said. "I think I can too." She said it with the particular certainty of a child reporting a fact rather than sharing a hope. "I heard one last night in my sleep, not a scary one." She tilted her head, like talking, but without the words, just the feeling. "What kind of feeling?" he said, careful, genuine. Lyra considered this with the concentration she gave to difficult questions. Like when Mama says she loves me before I fall asleep. That kind." She shrugged, satisfied with the comparison, and went to investigate a particularly interesting stick near the bench leg. Caius's face, when Sera looked at him, had done something she had no word for. Not undone, not broken. Something more like the expression of a person who has just understood the full dimensions of something they hadn't properly measured before, and the measurement is larger than expected. He looked down at Lyra and then back at Sera, and his eyes, dark brown, fully controlled all morning, had shifted at the edges again. The amber that meant the wolf was louder than the man. "She's already connected to her wolf," he said. "I know." Sera watched Lyra examine the stick with genuine scientific intensity. "She's had it since about 2. The dreams started then. I researched what I could without pack library access and determined it was unusual for her age, but not harmful. Her wolf is present and clear. She hasn't shifted yet, obviously, not at 4. No, she's years from that." He was watching Lyra the way he'd been watching her all week, with the sustained, unguarded attention of his wolf running ahead of his reason. But a wolf speaking in dreams before 10 is rare. It usually indicates a strong bond line. "The Blackmore line," she said. "Yes." He said it simply, without pride or claim, just acknowledgement. What it was. Pell had been very quiet through this. He was looking at Lyra with an expression that had gone soft in the specific way of a young person who'd seen very little softness recently and didn't quite know how to be around it. "What's going to happen?" he said, to Sera, not Caius. "To you, or generally," she said. "Both." She thought about what Damon had said. In 23 days. She thought about the 2 words she'd sent at 7 this morning, and what those 2 words had put in motion, and the shape of the weeks ahead. "I don't know yet," she said honestly, "but nothing is getting decided without you having a say in it. That's the only guarantee I can make." Pell nodded slowly, accepted this because he'd learned, over 19 years, that it was sometimes the most you could get and the most important thing to recognize when someone actually meant it. Caius stood. He was looking at Lyra, who had found that the stick was good for drawing patterns in the dirt and had begun a complex project with it. "Lyra," he said. She looked up. "I heard your wolf too." He said it quietly, like an answer to something. "In my sleep 3 nights ago, I didn't know whose it was until now." Lyra stared at him. "Okay," she said finally, with enormous gravity. Then she went back to her dirt drawing. Caius looked at Sera, and whatever was on his face in that moment, she stored it away in the section of herself she'd been carefully managing for 3 years, in the space next to the things she looked at only when she was sure she could withstand them. She wasn't sure yet, but she stored it anyway,